Age 48, my daughter spoke to me like a stranger, so I loved her quietly from a distance. This is my true story. I gave my life to raise my daughter. I worked hard every day to give her safety, comfort, and a good life. I believed she would always look at me as her father, her protector, her friend. But I was wrong. One day, she spoke to me like a stranger, with cold words and no warmth. My heart broke quietly. I could have shouted. I could have begged. But I chose silence instead. I chose to love her quietly from a distance. Before I tell you more, tell us where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. Please subscribe so my story reaches more people. I spent my life working for her. From the day she was born, I carried her in my heart and carried her on my shoulders. I worked through years of hardship, through sickness and sleepless nights, so she could have a safe place to grow. I gave up comforts I could have kept for myself. I gave up rest so she could sleep well. I gave up dreams so she could chase her own. Every coin I earned was saved for her. Every decision I made was shaped by her future. I believed she would see my work, my sacrifice, my quiet struggles, and know that they were for her. I believed she would know the depth of my devotion. I thought my years of labor, my calloused hands, my worn-out shoes were proof enough. I believed love was built in moments of giving without asking for thanks. I believed that what I gave her, a home, a life, a future, was something no words could repay. I thought she would stand by me one day, not out of obligation, but out of respect and love. I thought she would look at me with pride and warmth. I thought she would never treat me as a stranger. I worked long hours in fields under the sun, returning home tired and aching. I went without food so she could eat. I wore old clothes so she could have new ones. I gave my health to give her health. My hands became rough, my back bowed, my hair gray, but my heart stayed strong because I knew every sacrifice had purpose. I believed she would understand without me saying it. I believed love was quiet, built in daily acts of care and devotion. I believed my life's work was the life I gave her. I thought she would see me as her anchor. I thought she would always return to the home I built for her, not just for shelter, but for belonging. I thought she would remember the nights I stayed awake when she was sick, the mornings I woke early to prepare her for school, the evenings I sat quietly beside her when the world was too loud. I thought she would carry my love in her heart as I carried hers in mine. But devotion is not always seen. Sacrifice is not always understood. And love is not always returned in the way we imagine. I gave everything for her without asking for proof of gratitude, and I believed that the bond we shared was unshakable. I thought my role as her father was forever. I thought she would always speak to me as she once had, with openness and warmth. I thought she would never speak to me like a stranger. I thought I could trust in the years, the history, the love between us. I thought the foundation I had built for her could not be shaken by silence. I thought my devotion was enough to keep the distance away. But I learned that even the deepest devotion can be tested. I learned that a father's love can be ignored, even when it is silent and constant. I learned that giving without being heard can feel like giving into the wind. I remember thinking, in the quiet of night, how much I had given without complaint. I remembered every hardship I had endured without asking her to understand. I remembered every day I worked without rest so that she could rest easy. I remembered every tear I wiped away without letting her see mine. I remembered every night I prayed for her safety without her ever knowing. My devotion was my own, and I believed it was enough. But devotion without recognition can weigh heavy. I learned that love alone is not always enough to bridge distance when words and presence are absent. I learned that being devoted does not guarantee being heard. I learned that a father can spend decades pouring love into a life and still stand in silence when the child he loved walks away without explanation. I worked for her not to own her, but because I loved her. I worked for her because I wanted her to have a better life than I had. I worked for her because she was my world. I worked for her because being her father was my greatest honor. I thought love was enough to keep her close. I thought sacrifice was enough to keep her trust. But life taught me differently. I thought my devotion would build an unbreakable bridge between us. I thought my years of giving would create a bond no silence could break. I thought my work, my presence, my love would speak for themselves. But she spoke to me like a stranger. She stepped away. She withdrew without a word. My devotion became invisible to her, and my heart learned what silence could mean. Even now, I remember the weight of those years. Every tired step, every lost meal, every sleepless night. And I know I gave her everything a father could. I know I gave her my all. I know I worked not for recognition, but because love demanded it. My devotion was not a debt to be paid. It was my gift. And when she spoke to me like a stranger, I realized the truth. Sometimes love is given not for return, but because it must be given. And so I kept that devotion quietly, without complaint, without demand, without expectation. I kept it in my heart, where it remained untouched by rejection. I learned that love can be quiet, and devotion can survive silence. I learned that a father's gift is not only in what he gives, but in the willingness to give even when it is not seen. That was my devotion to her. A lifetime of giving, without claim, without promise, without guarantee. I gave because I loved. I gave because I could. I gave because it was my choice. And when her voice became distant, I chose to keep loving her quietly from afar, because true devotion does not end in anger. True devotion does not demand a reply. True devotion continues, even in silence. The first signs were quiet. I did not hear them at once. They crept in slowly, almost without warning, like the turning of a page in a book I thought I knew by heart. It was not a single moment, not a sharp break, but a gentle shifting of the air between us. I began to notice it in her voice, the way it sounded when she spoke to me. It lost its warmth. It became polite, careful, something measured rather than heartfelt. There was a distance in her words, as if she was speaking across a room, not across a table in the house we had built together. At first, I told myself it was nothing. She was growing, she was busy, she was learning life. I told myself the years change people, but I could feel it in my heart. A father senses when something changes. It was in her laughter. The laughter that once filled our home with light became lighter, almost unnatural. I heard it when she spoke to others. It was different from how she laughed when she spoke to me, and that difference began to ache inside me. I began to notice her avoiding my eyes. The warmth in her gaze grew colder, more distant. That change was small at first, but it became a quiet weight pressing against me. I began to watch how she spoke to me in ways I could not ignore. She stopped sharing her joys. She stopped telling me her small victories, the stories of her day, the dreams she once whispered to me at night. She stopped speaking of her troubles, of her worries, of her fears. Her voice became measured, clipped. She answered questions with short sentences, and the pauses between her words felt long, like she was weighing them before she spoke. I began to notice how she no longer asked about my day, no longer sought my company without reason. Even the little things, the way she once would enter my room without knocking, sit beside me, and share a smile, disappeared. I thought perhaps it was the rhythm of life. Perhaps she was distracted. But it was more than distraction. It was a change in the foundation of our connection. I began to feel her pulling away, piece by piece, moment by moment. At first, I told myself patience would be enough. I thought I had time to repair it. I thought love could bridge the distance, as it always had. I thought my years of giving her a safe home, a warm life, a steady hand would be enough to keep her close. But the silence between us was growing. I noticed it in her gestures. She began to avoid sitting with me for long. She would walk past me in the kitchen without stopping, without a glance. When she did speak, her voice sounded distant, as though she were speaking to someone far away. It was not harshness. It was absence. And absence, when it grows, speaks louder than any words could. I tried not to notice it first. I told myself I was imagining it. But silence can be a sound. Absence can be a presence. And I felt her absence like a quiet weight on my chest. I tried to talk to her. I asked her gently if everything was all right. She would smile and say, "I'm fine." But the tone of her voice told me otherwise. That phrase became a shield, a quiet wall between us. I began to realize she was guarding herself from me, even when she did not speak the words. Even in the small things, the change was clear. She stopped coming to the dining table when I called. She stopped asking me about my work, my day, my health. She no longer lingered in the house when she could have. She began spending more time out, more time away, leaving the house quieter than it had been for years. And in those quiet moments, I could hear the echo of our lost closeness. I tried to hold on to the warmth we once had. I tried to speak gently, to ask her to sit with me, to share a meal, but her answers became shorter, her visits fewer, her presence lighter. I noticed her avoiding the small touches, a hand on my shoulder, a smile across the table, a glance filled with warmth. Those things that once connected us began to fade. I was watching her drift away, and I felt powerless to stop it. I began to think about what had changed. Had I failed her somehow? Had I missed signs along the way? I replayed years in my mind, searching for the moment when things began to shift. I remembered her childhood, the way she had once looked at me with trust, the way she would come to me when she was hurt, the way she would speak to me as if I held the answer to all her questions. That connection had changed. It had eroded, not in a single moment, but slowly, quietly, until one day I noticed she was no longer speaking to me as she once had. It was not a single act of cruelty. It was a quiet withdrawal. It was the turning away of her heart. It was a distance that grew without words to explain it. I could feel her moving farther away, not with sharp words, but with silence. Silence became her language. Distance became her reply. And I began to understand that her heart was no longer in the same place as mine. I watched her life from the doorway of my own home. I watched her conversations without being part of them. I watched her smile at others in ways she no longer smiled at me. I noticed she was still present in the house, but she was not truly there with me. I felt it in my bones, in my heart, and in my quiet nights. I began to understand that the signs of distance were not just absence of speech, but absence of heart. I did not force her to speak. I did not demand her attention. I believed love should not be a command. I believed she would come to me when she was ready. But each day the distance grew. I felt her slipping away. And in my silence, I began to grieve the loss of the closeness we once had. I began to understand that losing connection does not always come with noise. Sometimes it comes quietly, with small changes that speak louder than words. The signs were all there if I looked closely. Her eyes, once warm with familiarity, now looked past me. Her voice, once filled with comfort, now spoke with caution. Her presence, once constant, became rare. And I realized that those signs were not mistakes. They were truths. They were truths that I could not ignore. So I chose to watch. I chose to keep my silence, to not force her to speak. I chose to let her distance be her own choice, while I kept my own heart open. I chose to love her quietly, even as she spoke to me like a stranger. I began to understand that love does not always require presence. Sometimes love means giving space. Sometimes love means accepting the distance without breaking. And so the signs became my teachers. They taught me patience. They taught me humility. They taught me that love does not demand a return. They taught me that distance, though painful, can be an act of love if held in quiet grace. I learned that the first sign of distance is silence, and the last sign of love is letting go without bitterness. From that moment, I decided to change my own response. I would not plead for her closeness. I would not chase her presence. I would let my love remain, quietly and without expectation. I would keep my devotion alive in silence, and I would let her speak to me in her own way, even if it meant speaking as a stranger. That was my choice. To hold her place in my heart quietly, to watch her life without interfering, to love her without demand, and to let silence speak the words I could no longer say aloud. The days after that night of realization were heavy and quiet. I sat often in my old chair by the window, not because I expected anything, but because it was the place where I could think without interruption. Outside, life moved in its ordinary way. Birds came and went, leaves swayed in the breeze, neighbors walked past with nods and smiles. Inside, there was only silence, not the silence of peace, but the silence that follows loss, a silence filled with the echoes of what once was. I found myself replaying her words from that evening over and over. They were not harsh, but they carried a distance that my heart could not close. The politeness in her voice was like a carefully constructed wall, built over years without my knowing. I wondered when the change had started, when her warmth toward me had shifted to a cold civility. I thought of the moments I had missed, the small signs I had chosen to ignore. How many times had I brushed away the quiet? How many times had I told myself she was busy, or tired, or distracted? And now I knew it had been more than that. It had been a change in her heart toward me. I thought of her as a child, and the contrast felt almost unbearable. I remembered the nights she clung to me in fear, the mornings she ran into my arms with laughter. I remembered her little hands clutching mine, her voice calling Papa without hesitation or doubt. Those memories now felt like treasures locked away behind a door I could no longer open. It was as if time had quietly taken her from me without a goodbye, and I was left to stand in the quiet hallways of my own heart, wondering when she had stopped coming home to me. In that silence, I began to search for answers. I thought of all the sacrifices I had made for her, the long hours I had worked so she could have a better life, the moments I had set aside my own needs so she could grow with comfort and safety. I remembered giving her my strength without asking for recognition, holding her up when the world seemed too heavy for her to bear. And yet, her silence now told me that my presence no longer mattered to her in the same way. It was a truth that stung deeper than any harsh word could have. The silence became a mirror. It reflected not only the distance between us, but also my own response to it. I realized that I had spent so long speaking to her with my heart that I had forgotten to listen to her silence. Her silence was not empty. It was speaking in its own way, telling me that something had changed between us, something I could not simply repair with words. That realization settled into me quietly, like dust falling over years of life. I could no longer pretend that everything was the same. I began to reflect on what love meant in this space between us. I asked myself if love was only about presence, about conversation, about holding hands and speaking through the night, or if love could be something quieter, something that exists even when words are gone and closeness fades. I decided that love is not measured by recognition alone. It is also measured by the willingness to let go, to step back, and to hold someone in your heart even when they have turned away. I thought about the years we had lived together, the times I had given without asking for anything in return. I thought about the times I had chosen silence over confrontation, hoping that patience would heal what distance could not. And yet, I had learned that silence can be a choice, but it cannot always bridge the gap when hearts have drifted apart. Her silence was not waiting to be filled with words. It was a choice she had made, consciously or not. And so, I had to make my own choice in response. I sat in my chair and let my mind travel through the years, remembering her first steps, her first words, her first day of school. I remembered standing at her bedside during storms, whispering promises of safety. I remembered her tears and laughter, her dreams and fears. I held those memories tightly, not as a way to hold on to her presence now, but as a way to understand what had been lost. In those reflections, I found both grief and clarity. The grief was heavy, deeper than I could put into words. It was the grief of losing a child to time, to change, to choices that could not be undone. It was the grief of watching someone slip away without knowing how to call them back. And yet, within that grief, there was clarity. I realized that I could not force her to speak to me as she once had. I could not demand the warmth I once took for granted. The only thing I could do was decide how I would respond to this silence. I reflected on my own silence. I realized that I had spoken to her too much, without listening. I had filled our time together with words, advice, and reminders of love, but I had not always been still enough to hear her truth. Perhaps that was part of why the distance grew, because I was speaking into a silence that needed to be heard, not filled. That understanding changed something inside me. It made me see that silence could be an act of love, not only a sign of absence. So I began to reflect on what it would mean to love her quietly, to love her without demanding her attention, without asking for words in return, without expecting her to cross the distance I could not bridge. I decided that my love would become a silent presence in her life, even if she never acknowledged it. I would let her choose her own path, and I would respect that choice by holding my own peace. In my reflection, I came to a quiet acceptance. I knew there would be no grand reconciliation, no sudden return to the closeness we once had. I knew that my daughter's voice would remain distant, that her presence beside me would be polite, but guarded. And I knew that the only thing left for me to do was to turn inward, to carry her in my heart without holding her to my own expectations. I began to see that silence was not the absence of love. It was a form of love that asked for nothing in return. It was the kind of love that does not need recognition. It is the love that endures when closeness fades and words grow cold. It is the love that remains when distance becomes the truth between two hearts. That realization became a turning point for me. It shaped the way I chose to live with her silence. I stopped waiting for her to speak to me the way she once did. I stopped asking for her warmth or closeness. Instead, I learned to hold her place in my heart quietly, without demand. I learned that to love from a distance is to give without expectation, to hold without grasping. I reflected on the years ahead, knowing that time would not reverse what had been lost. I knew that the quiet between us would continue, that her voice might never return to me in the way I had hoped. But I also knew that my love could still live on. It could live in my silent prayers for her happiness, in my quiet acts of care, in the memories I kept safe. That night of reflection became a lesson I carry still. It taught me that grief and love can coexist. It taught me that silence can speak louder than words. It taught me that letting go can be the greatest act of love. And it taught me that even when a father is treated like a stranger by his child, his love need not vanish. In my silent reflection, I found peace. Not the peace of reconciliation, but the peace of acceptance. Not the peace of having her close, but the peace of holding her gently in my heart. And I learned that even if she never spoke to me again, as she once had, I could still love her quietly from a distance. That is how I learned to turn my grief into quiet strength. That is how I learned that silence can be a language of love. That is how I learned to live with her absence without losing the bond that once existed. And so, I sit in my chair still, carrying her in my heart. Not as a child I can hold, but as a memory I keep. I love her still, quietly and without expectation. I have learned that silence, when spoken with the heart, can be louder than any words. And I have learned that to love without possession is to love truly. That night of reflection was not an ending. It was the beginning of a new way of loving her, a quiet love, without demand, without expectation, without complaint. A love that exists beyond words, a love that simply is. And I keep that love in my heart every day, even when she speaks to me like a stranger. After the nights of silent reflection, I began living in a different way with her absence. I stopped asking for explanations, stopped seeking reasons, stopped hoping she would come closer. The questions I once carried, why did she change? What did I do wrong? I laid them down quietly. I chose not to fill the silence with my own voice, but to make peace with it. My silence became a shield and a gift against further hurt, and a gift of respect for her space. I continued caring for her, but differently now. No longer did I knock on her door expecting warmth. No longer did I leave my presence in places where she might notice with obligation rather than love. I gave quietly, small acts without acknowledgement. I fixed what needed fixing in her life without comment. I left her favorite tea on the table, repaired her shoes, cleared her pathway without asking if she noticed. My care became a silent offering. I watched her life from my distance. I saw her grow in her own way, taking steps I could not follow. I celebrated her victories quietly, without applause. Her achievements were mine to treasure, even if she did not share them with me. I felt proud, even if she no longer looked my way. I felt love, even when it was not returned. That became my new understanding, that love need not demand recognition to be real. In my quiet distance, I learned patience in a way I had never known. I stopped measuring love by the warmth of conversation. I stopped seeking proof that I mattered. I accepted that she may never again speak to me as she once did. I accepted that her heart may have moved on, and I accepted that my love could exist quietly without her knowing. I gave up trying to bridge the gap with words. I gave up trying to win her attention. I gave up trying to pull her back. Instead, I gave myself to the practice of being quietly present. My presence became a silent promise that no matter her distance, no matter her silence, my love remained. I carried her in my heart without asking her to meet me there. The quiet distance became my choice. I chose it not out of bitterness, but out of respect. I chose it because I realized that love cannot be forced. I chose it because I understood that some things are given freely, without expectation. And I chose it because I wanted to protect my own heart from the weight of longing that could no longer be fulfilled. Every day I learned more about the nature of this quiet distance. It was not emptiness. It was a space filled with memory, care, and a steady beating of love that did not require response. I kept her in my thoughts without asking for her presence. I kept her in my heart without asking for her words. I kept her in my silence without demanding her understanding. It was a strange peace, this quiet distance. It was not the closeness I had once known, but it was still something sacred. It was a choice to let go of what I could not change and to hold on to what I still could, my love for her. I learned that distance can sometimes be an act of love, that silence can sometimes be an expression deeper than words, and that loving without possession is a form of freedom. I found that in the quiet distance, I began to heal. The ache in my heart softened, not because she returned to me, but because I had chosen a different way to love her. A way without expectation, a way without demand, a way that accepted her as she was, even if she no longer saw me as she once did. Living in that quiet distance taught me humility. It taught me that my love was not for my own recognition, but for her. It taught me that sometimes the greatest gift a parent can give is the freedom to love without attachment, and it taught me that even when the bond changes, the love can remain intact. I began to understand that my silence was not surrender. It was a choice to preserve dignity, both hers and mine. It was a choice to step back so she could live her life fully, without my presence weighing on her. And it was a choice to keep my own heart safe while keeping her in it. From that quiet distance, I learned to watch without interference, to support without asking for thanks, to give without wanting something in return. I became the silent witness to her life, the unseen keeper of her joys and struggles. I did not ask her to acknowledge me. I did not ask her to change. I simply let her live, and I let myself love her quietly. The quiet distance became a sacred space between us. It was where I could still hold her in my heart without needing her to hold me in hers. It was where I could still honor the years we shared without demanding the years to come. It was where I could transform my grief into a gentle strength and my loss into a lasting peace. I learned to be content with this quiet distance. I learned to see it not as absence, but as another form of presence. A presence that says, without words, I still love you. A presence that exists quietly, without insistence or claim. A presence that endures even when the world changes. So I stayed in that quiet distance. I kept my love in the shadows, unseen but steady. I kept my heart open, without expectation. I kept my silence as my way of speaking to her. And in that quiet distance, I found a deeper understanding of love, one that does not demand closeness to survive. I found that love could live in silence, that love could live in absence, that love could live quietly from afar, and I knew that this was my choice, my gift, and my answer to her silence. I kept my quiet distance not because I wanted to give up, but because I wanted to give her the freedom to live and myself the freedom to love without pain. And in that quiet distance, I found a peace I had never known before. From my quiet place, I watched her life unfold without interference. I did not call or visit uninvited. I kept my distance, letting her live her own story. I heard of her successes through whispers, through small notes, through neighbors. I felt pride quietly, without announcing it. Her happiness became my silent joy, even if she no longer shared it with me. I did not ask for her gratitude. I did not seek proof she remembered me. I simply carried her victories quietly in my heart, holding them like treasures. I learned to watch without needing to touch. I saw her walk her own path, making choices that were hers alone. I learned that love is not possession. Love does not demand control. Love can be quiet and unseen and still be real. I let her go without bitterness, letting her freedom become my peace. I found comfort in knowing she lived her life fully, even if that life no longer included me closely. I kept my silence as a way to honor her independence. Sometimes I thought of speaking, of crossing the quiet line to tell her I still cared. But I stayed still. I let my silence be my voice. My absence became a message that she could feel without hearing. My quiet distance became my way of loving her without intrusion. I let her grow without me, and I grew quietly beside her, in my own way. I discovered that true love can be given without being given back. That love can exist without demand. That love can be presence without closeness. I began to understand that watching from afar was not the same as losing. I was still part of her life in my own silent way. I was still keeping her safe in my thoughts. I was still holding her place in my heart without possession or claim. That became my new purpose, to love her quietly, without expectation, without demand, without need. To let her live her life while keeping her in mine, in my own silent way. The days passed, and I stayed in that quiet observation. I did not intervene. I did not push. I let her walk her path while I stayed in mine. I learned that absence can be a form of love, and that silence can be a gift. I let her be free, even if it meant I was alone. I let my love become something steady, unshaken, and without demand. That became my strength. I carried her laughter in memory, her steps in my dreams, her absence in my heart. I learned that love from afar can still be full. I learned that watching without touching is not emptiness, but a form of giving. I learned that love can live quietly, without noise, without expectation, without demand. That is what I chose. That is what I lived. That is how I loved her quietly, from afar. Acceptance was not easy for me. For years I had held hope. Hope that my daughter would speak to me like before. Hope that her voice would return to warmth. Hope that her eyes would once again meet mine with love. But the cold truth was that things had changed. Our home no longer carried the laughter it once had. The space between us had grown. That space became real, solid, and heavy. At first I tried to bridge it. I tried to call her more. I tried to speak softly when we met. I tried to bring her little gifts. I tried to remind her of old days when we laughed together. I tried to make her remember. But my attempts were met with silence or polite distance. That silence taught me something. I could not force closeness. The day I truly accepted her distance was a quiet morning. I sat in my old chair by the window. The light came soft, golden, through the curtains. I watched her walk past the garden without looking my way. I felt the ache in my chest, but instead of calling out, I stayed quiet. In that moment, acceptance began to grow inside me. I began to understand that love is not always about presence. Sometimes love is about letting go. Letting someone live their life even when they choose to walk away. Letting them have space without resentment. That day, I decided to stop hoping for the closeness we once had. Acceptance became a quiet practice, Every morning, I reminded myself that she had her own path to walk. I told myself that my role was no longer to hold her hand, but to allow her to live freely. This was not a decision made in a moment. It was built over months of quiet observation, over nights of replaying conversations in my head, over years of living beside her while feeling unseen. Acceptance was a gradual understanding that she was her own person now, that she had her own life to live, and that my job as her father was not to control that life, but to respect it. I learned that acceptance is different from giving up. Giving up would have meant anger. Giving up would have meant bitterness. Acceptance meant peace. Acceptance meant letting go without losing love. I learned that acceptance could carry strength, not weakness, that it could hold dignity instead of despair. I began to see that in letting go of my expectations, I was finding freedom for both of us, for her to be who she was and for me to be who I was. Acceptance was my way of preserving the love I had without demanding anything in return. This understanding brought me to a deeper place. I began to look at my daughter not with the hope of change, but with gratitude for who she was. I remembered the years when she was small and I held her close. I remembered her laughter, her first steps, her first words. Those memories became treasures. They became proof that love had existed and still existed quietly, even if it was not spoken now. I accepted that love could change shape over time, that it could become quiet and still, but remain powerful. I learned that acceptance is the act of loving without controlling, loving without insisting, loving without needing a response. I practiced acceptance every day. I stopped trying to force her to speak to me. I stopped leaving messages. I stopped knocking on her door without invitation. I stopped asking questions she would not answer. Instead, I kept my love in silence. I kept it in small acts. A warm meal prepared without telling her. A light left on in the hallway. A chair kept for her in the living room. These small acts became my way of speaking without words. My way of saying, I still care. Acceptance allowed me to love her quietly, without argument, without pressure. Through acceptance, I also learned to release anger. At first, there was anger in my heart. Anger that she had closed her voice to me. Anger that she had treated me like a stranger. But acceptance dissolved that anger slowly. I realized that her silence was her choice, not a reflection of my worth. I realized that bitterness would only weigh me down. Acceptance lifted that weight. It allowed me to rest without needing her to explain. It allowed me to live without holding on to a fight that could not be won. Acceptance taught me that peace is the truest form of love. I began to see acceptance as a gift, not just for her, but for myself. It freed me from the need to change her. It freed me from the pain of unanswered questions. It freed me from the chains of expectation. I began to accept that my daughter's path was not mine to walk, that her choices were hers alone, that my love could exist without her return. Acceptance became the place where I found peace, where I let go of what I could not change, where I gave myself permission to let her go without losing my love for her. Acceptance did not erase the pain. It did not erase the nights I felt her absence deeply, but it softened the pain. It turned longing into quiet remembrance. It turned hurt into understanding. It turned loss into a form of continued love. I accepted that I could not change the past, and I could not control her future. But I could control how I lived with her absence. And I chose to live with acceptance. As days turned into months, acceptance became my way of life. I no longer counted the times she had spoken to me with coldness. I no longer measured her visits or replies. I no longer waited by the phone. I accepted that our relationship had changed forever. And in that acceptance, I found a strange kind of joy. A joy that came from letting go of the battle and keeping the love. A joy that came from knowing I had given her all I could, and now I gave her freedom. Acceptance also brought clarity. I understood that my silence had been my answer. My quiet distance had been my way of speaking. And acceptance allowed me to rest in that choice. It gave me strength to live without explanations. It gave me strength to let her find her way without me in her voice. Acceptance became my quiet form of strength, my way of turning heartbreak into peace, my way of living love without expectation. I carried acceptance with me into every day. I carried it into every thought of her. I carried it into every quiet evening where her absence was most felt. Acceptance became the thread that held together my broken heart. It became the quiet voice that said, "I still love you, even from a distance." It became the truth I lived with, that loving without answer was still loving, that letting go without goodbye was still love, that acceptance was not defeat, but peace. Acceptance taught me something precious, that love does not always need presence, that love does not always need words, that love can survive in silence, that love can exist even when the voice on the other side is silent. I learned that acceptance is not the end of love. It is a deeper form of love, a love that is steady, patient, and without demand, a love that can live quietly in the heart, without breaking. Now, as I sit in the quiet of my old age, I look back and see acceptance as the greatest gift I have given myself. It allowed me to turn my pain into peace, to turn my loss into quiet strength, to turn my heartbreak into a lasting form of love. I see now that acceptance was the way I kept my daughter in my heart without losing myself. It was the way I loved her quietly, without possession, without demand, without expectation. Acceptance became my way of healing. It became my way of living without bitterness. It became my way of loving without control. It became my way of saying goodbye without actually letting go. Acceptance was not silence. It was love spoken in its purest form. And that is what I hold now in my quiet old age. Acceptance. I accept that she will never speak to me the way she once did. I accept that her heart may never return to me. I accept that some distance cannot be bridged, but I also accept that my love for her will never fade, that her place in my heart will remain forever. Acceptance is my truth, my peace, my final gift to her. Peace came slowly to me. It did not arrive with a single moment of clarity or a sudden change of heart. It came quietly, like the evening light that falls softly over an old garden. After years of longing, after years of unanswered calls and avoided conversations, after years of carrying the weight of her absence in my heart, peace came as a quiet understanding. It was not the loud kind of peace that fills the streets after war, but a gentle peace that lives inside a man who has stopped fighting for what he cannot change. Peace was my companion in those days, my answer to my own grief. At first, peace felt strange. I had lived with hope and pain for so long that I did not know how to live without them. I was used to carrying questions, to sitting in silence filled with uncertainty. But peace came when I stopped asking questions I could not answer. It came when I stopped chasing her voice and started listening to my own heart. I realized peace was not found in her returning my words, but in giving my own words to silence. Peace was knowing that my love for her could exist without recognition, without response. That was the deepest lesson I ever learned. To live in peace, I learned to live without expectation. I stopped measuring my days by whether she spoke to me or came to visit. I stopped counting the hours spent in waiting. I stopped holding on to imagined conversations that would never happen. I learned to let each day be enough by itself. Peace became my daily practice. Each morning, I woke and told myself, "Today is enough." And in that simple acceptance, I found a quiet joy that I had never known before. Peace was not something I found alone. It came from letting go of the need to control her and giving myself permission to live my own life. I began to walk more slowly through my days. I began to notice the small moments I had missed before, the way sunlight fell across my garden, the sound of birds in the morning, the quiet laughter of neighbors in the street. Peace taught me to see beauty in simple things again. It taught me that life could be rich even without the closeness I had once dreamed of with her. I began to understand that peace comes from within. It is not given by others. It cannot be demanded. It must be chosen, every day, with quiet intention. I chose peace the moment I stopped clinging to the past. The moment I stopped measuring my worth by her attention or absence. The moment I told myself that my love was enough, even without her knowing. Peace became my own quiet rebellion against loss. It was my way of saying that her absence would not destroy me, that my heart could still be whole. In peace, I found forgiveness. Not loud forgiveness, not spoken forgiveness, but quiet forgiveness that lived in my heart. I forgave her for the distance she had created. I forgave her for the silence that had grown between us. I forgave her for leaving without words. Forgiveness was the light that made peace possible. Without forgiveness, my heart would have stayed heavy with resentment. But forgiveness lifted that weight. It allowed me to carry her absence with grace instead of bitterness. Peace also gave me strength. I found strength in living without asking for explanations. I found strength in letting go without a fight. I found strength in keeping my heart open even when it was closed to me. Peace became my armor against the pain of loss. It became my way of surviving the quiet absence of my daughter's voice. In peace, I found the power to move forward without losing the love I held inside me. I discovered that peace is not the end of love. It is the way love continues when words and presence are gone. My peace was my way of continuing to love her without needing her to return it in the way I once wished. It was my quiet answer to the heartbreak I had lived with for so many years. Peace was my choice to live without regret, without anger, without bitterness. It was my way of turning silence into something meaningful. To live in peace, I learned to let go of control. I could not make her speak to me. I could not change her heart. I could not turn back time to when she was close to me. But I could choose how I lived with her absence. I could choose whether to carry pain or to carry peace. I chose peace. And in that choice, I found a freedom I had never known before. Peace became my daily companion. I learned to greet each morning with gratitude rather than longing. I learned to find joy in the small things, a clear sky, the warmth of tea, the quiet laughter of friends. I learned that peace is not something to wait for, it is something to live. Peace is an action. It is a choice to live with acceptance, forgiveness, and love without demand. In peace, I found my voice again. Not a voice that called out for answers, not a voice that demanded return, but a quiet voice that said, "It is enough." A voice that said, "I loved her, and I still do." A voice that said, "I will let her go without losing myself." That voice became my prayer, my way of speaking to the absence in my life, my way of honoring what was lost without losing myself. As the years passed, peace became my home. It was not loud or celebrated. It was quiet and steady, like the slow movement of the seasons. Peace lived in my heart when the nights felt cold. Peace lived in my breath when the days felt long. Peace lived in my steps when I walked alone. It became the foundation of my later years, a quiet strength that carried me beyond loss. Now, as I sit in the twilight of my life, I look back and see peace as the greatest gift I ever gave myself. It was born from heartbreak. It was born from silence. It was born from acceptance. Peace became the way I honored my love for her without losing my dignity. It became the way I lived without bitterness. It became the way I turned a story of betrayal into a story of quiet strength. Peace taught me that some wounds cannot be healed, but they can be lived with. That some losses cannot be returned, but they can be accepted. That some love cannot be spoken, but it can be carried quietly in the heart. My peace became my answer to a life of longing. My peace became my answer to her silence. My peace became my way of living with love without possession. Peace is my legacy now. It is what I leave behind. Not anger, not regret, not sorrow, but peace. Peace for myself. Peace for her. Peace for the years we shared and the years we walked apart. I carry peace with me every day. It is my quiet companion in the empty spaces where her voice once was. It is my quiet prayer for what was lost. Final thought. Peace is not given. It is chosen. And I chose it. I chose to let go. I chose to forgive. I chose to love quietly. I chose peace. Now, as an old man, I sit quietly and tell this story without anger, without bitterness, without desire for revenge. Time has a way of softening the sharp edges of hurt. Time changes the way wounds are felt. And time has taught me that some of life's greatest lessons are written not in loud declarations, but in quiet reflection. I have lived long enough to understand the depth of my own heart and the meaning of what I endured. I have learned that life is not measured by the moments we demand attention, but by the moments we choose peace. When I look back on the years I shared with her, I do not see only betrayal or loss. I see a lifetime of learning. I see the quiet transformation of a heart that once demanded answers into a heart that simply knows. I see the journey from love that needs return to love that gives without expectation. I see a path that led me to peace. And in that reflection, I find gratitude. Gratitude for the pain, because it taught me strength. Gratitude for the silence, because it taught me depth. Gratitude for the distance, because it taught me love without possession. I have learned that love is not always loud. It is not always spoken. Sometimes love is a quiet presence, a stillness beside another soul. Sometimes love is choosing not to speak, not to fight, not to demand. Sometimes love is letting go without losing the care you hold inside. I have learned that the greatest love is not shown in holding tightly, but in giving freely and walking away when holding becomes harm. And I have learned that such love leaves a mark deeper than words ever could. As I reflect, I understand that peace is not a single moment, but a lifetime of choices. Every day, I chose peace over anger. Every day, I chose silence over argument. Every day, I chose to love quietly rather than demand her attention. And those choices became my answer to betrayal. They became my way of saying that her absence would not take away my dignity, nor my capacity to love. Reflection has shown me that peace is not weakness. It is strength refined by time and tested by loss. I think about the nights when I lay awake, feeling the quiet ache of her absence beside me. I think about the mornings when her voice was missing and the house felt emptier than before. I think about the countless times I reached for my phone to call, only to stop myself. Those moments were not lost. They were lessons. They were lessons in letting go, in accepting change, in finding a way to carry love without possession. Reflection has shown me that every moment of silence was part of my journey to peace. In my reflection, I see how much I have grown. I have learned patience beyond words. I have learned endurance beyond comfort. I have learned that some wounds cannot be healed, and some answers cannot be found. I have learned to live with questions without needing them answered. I have learned to carry absence as a quiet companion without letting it destroy my spirit. Reflection has shown me that life is as much about letting go as it is about holding on. I also reflect on forgiveness. Forgiveness was never easy. At first, my heart carried the weight of pain and betrayal like a stone. I thought forgiveness meant forgetting. But reflection has shown me that forgiveness is not about erasing what happened. Forgiveness is about freeing yourself from the hold of hurt. Forgiveness is a gift you give to yourself as much as to another. In reflection, I see that forgiveness became my peace. It became the soft ground where my heart could rest. Now, in my later years, reflection has become a habit. I sit quietly in my garden, in my room, in my thoughts, and remember the path I have walked. I remember the mornings filled with hope and the nights filled with longing. I remember the years of quiet sacrifice and the years of unanswered questions. I remember the silence between us and how it became my teacher. Reflection has taught me that my story is not one of loss alone, but of learning and quiet triumph. I think about what I have learned about life. I have learned that relationships change, people change, love changes, and that change can be painful. But I have also learned that change can bring growth if you are willing to see it. I have learned that peace is the truest form of love you can give yourself, and I have learned that living with grace is the finest revenge against betrayal. Reflection has taught me that life's value lies not in holding on, but in knowing when to let go. Reflection has shown me that my silence was not weakness. My silence was my answer. My silence was my way of loving without destroying myself. My silence was my peace. And in reflection, I understand that peace is not the absence of pain, but the presence of understanding. Peace is the choice to live fully, even when what you have lost can never be returned. Reflection has taught me that peace is the most powerful answer to hurt. Now, as I speak these words softly to myself, I see the shape of my life. I see a life that carried love despite silence, that carried dignity despite loss, that carried hope despite absence. Reflection has shown me that my life was never defined by what I lost, but by how I chose to live after losing it. And that, in the end, is my greatest lesson. Reflection has shown me that peace is not given. Peace is chosen, and I have chosen it every day. My final reflection is simple. I would tell any man who feels the ache of silence, the sting of absence, the weight of betrayal, to remember this. Love does not always demand presence. Love does not always need recognition. True love is quiet. True love is giving without expecting. True love is letting go without losing. And true peace comes from accepting what is, without clinging to what was. My reflection is that I have lived this truth. I have chosen it, and it has made my heart whole. Final thought. Now, as I look back, I see that my silence was my voice, my absence was my answer, and my peace was my victory. I let her go, I let myself grow, and I loved quietly from a distance. That is my story. That is my truth.